happiness comes from the inside out.
When we're living congruently with our values, there's happiness because there is that sense of wholeness.
Wholeness is when the way of your being matches the truth of your being.
In this episode, we are focusing on the Enneagram Type 1, the reformer, sometimes called the perfectionist or the visionary. If you are a Type 1, you'll want to listen up and you will learn much about yourself. And just so you know, as a bit of a warning, it might not feel great all of the time. We're notorious when working with an Enneagram to just feel like we're hearing nails on the chalkboard when we learn our type. That's one of the clues that you're in the right place. And I don't know why that's true. I think because a lot of times when the Enneagram is talked about, it's very negatively, and we kind of make fun in a way instead of learning. But that's why I always like to remind people with the Enneagram is that what will feel like nails on the chalkboard is actually the very clues and it just is a clear path in how to find better ways of feeling happiness and joy and success in your life. It's a roadmap. It's a literal roadmap. So calling on the reformer, we will reform those ways of thinking about nails on the chalkboard or feeling that way. We're going to reform it. So you can kind of see how this goes. So for Type 1s, listen up, hold on. It's going to be okay. You're awesome. What would we do without you? For the rest of us types, we will all recognize traits in this episode. But the Type 1 just takes them to an art form, makes an art form out of them. So that's the difference. I'm taking a lot of my information from the book Enneagram Empowerment, and I've got a link in the show notes, and it's an awesome one. She calls the Type 1 the visionary. I'm sticking with the reformer. That's what I've learned. That's how I was taught and trained. So I'm just going to use that. If you want to learn your type for free and get more information, go to michellewinkel.com/Enneagram. I have got a whole page dedicated to this, and I will even send you information about your type. So that is mechellewingle.com/Enneagram, or it's just one of the tabs. And you can go there, click on to take a test, come back, send me your results, and I'll send you some information out. So just to kind of get a feel for the Type 1s, there are some famous Type 1s I kind of want to talk about. Martha Stewart, Michelle Obama, Gandhi, Steve Jobs, Margaret Thatcher, Hillary Clinton. These, Kate Middleton is a Type 1, according to the internet. And I just want you to think about these people, Martha Stewart, Michelle Obama, Gandhi, Steve Jobs. When I think about their facial features, there's a similarity to them even. They have kind of a stoic look on their face versus, here's a Type 8. So just in comparison, listen to these types: Kamala Harris, Clint Eastwood, Winston Churchill, Aretha Franklin, Chelsea Handler. When I think of those, that I almost just, my forehead almost just crinkles into a little kind of a scowl. Type 8s are they're very power-minded. They struggle with some control. So you can see how those types, there's just this different even countenance about them versus, these people that are the Type 1s will stand up straight and they are serious and that type of thing. Just to kind of get a feel for these Type 1s, Type 1s are all about doing right and following the rules and that type of thing. Ones want to make themselves, other people, and the world around them better. They see the world not just for what it is, but what it could be. And they want everything they touch to meet the highest possible standards. And they see potential. They're kind of the ones that they're great if you need somebody to edit your essay or your book. Type 1s are great at it. They can help you create and make something better. They tend to be conscientious and rule followers, and they care about having a good reputation. Their moral compass is strong, and they might see the world in black and white. They have a tendency to do that. Sometimes they're known as being critical or judgmental, but they are not as judgmental or critical of other people as they are of themselves. Or maybe some of the other types would be more outwardly critical. They're very inwardly critical, and they have a harsh voice that lives inside their head. And it's constantly wanting them to do better and trying to level up and to obey and those type of things. They might struggle with perfectionism. In fact, some people call them the perfectionists. I don't like to call them that because that kind of makes it sound like it's negative, and that's not the point. The ones in their perfecting, that little piece of the pie perfects all of us. We need someone to stand up and say, we can do this better. We can do this better. Some of the Enneagram in the book, there's a page that talks about what these Enneagrams might say to themselves. And here's some quotes from type 1s. I am responsible and reliable. I have been called a perfectionist and told that I should loosen up. Another Enneagram type 1 would say, I make an effort to be kind and honest. I am really hard on myself and have a hard time letting go. I'm good at improving things, whether that's ideas, plans, events, designs, or even grammar. Sometimes I come across as judgmental or harsh. I give good advice. People can trust me to have a sensible opinion. They might say, there's a lot of weight on my shoulders. I have a lot of responsibilities, and I don't want to let anyone down. The motivations, what gives a type 1 motivation is to be well, to do well, and be in the right. They want to be respected, and they want to be good. Their key fears are like, I'm going to make a mistake. I might mess up. Something's wrong with me. I'm not good enough. These are some things that they will say. Their key obstacles: anger and resentment, irritation and maybe passive aggression, perfectionism and control. Here's the first place that we can stop and look at the Enneagram and how we can look to the different types and to ourselves for answers. So in I will mess up, in that feeling of I will mess up, the feeling is that we have to become this perfectionist and not mess up. But we need to reform that idea. Maybe reform it into I might mess up once in a while, or we reform it into something's wrong with me, into there are times I make mistakes, and we work towards being okay with that. In the Enneagram Shape itself, the way that the lines match up aren't just pretty. They teach us some things. Also at that michellewingle.com, you can download a graphic that shows you all of this information a little bit simpler, that you can learn about these things. But what's connected to a type 1 is when a type 1 goes into stress, they will begin to look like a type 4. And a type 4 is more secluded and more alone and those kind of things. Now, for a type 4, when that's their genuine, authentic selves, it doesn't come across to the rest of us like a problem. It's authentic to that person. When a 1 is acting like a 4, we feel it almost inside. It feels like something's off or what's going on, or those feelings when you're like, are you okay? Because that's not their authentic self. So in stress or when they're unhealthy, they're going to take on characteristics of the type 4, and they might become very emotional or sensitive, which is a wonderful thing, but it's not the type 1. They may be tender, and that is just not, we even though it's a nice, comforting thing for someone to have those things, and that's true, it will not feel correct to us with that person because it's not their authentic selves. But type 1 would kind of start to be a little more alone or kind of seclude themselves, and they get kind of emotional, and they start to be really sensitive. So what do? Well, that's what the other connecting line tells it. It says, hey, push into the type 7, and the type 7 is going to balance you out. The 7 is all about optimism and positivity. Type 1 isn't just going to become, Mr. or Mrs. optimistic and positive, because that wouldn't feel authentic either. But we're going to take some of those hints for a minute to pull us out of this type 4 stress when we go into that type 4 stress. And so it's really a roadmap into feeling better and to pulling ourselves out, recognizing what's not going okay in our lives. And that's what's so great about the Enneagram. Each type of the Enneagram usually have similar experiences in their childhood that helped them form this type within themselves. And type 1s were usually at a young age, they tried to be the model child. They were probably internalizing a lot of the voices that said, be good, try hard, don't be childish, be better. They just kind of internalized those thoughts. They needed to understand what was good and what was right and what was wrong. A lot of times maybe the type 1s were expected to kind of fulfill expectations that their parents had, or to kind of recoup the unfulfilled dreams of their parents. So a lot of type 1s felt like they got the love from their parents by meeting their expectations and being like their parents. And many of them are gifted children. They're very intelligent, those kind of things, because they're standard, and that perfectionism does so. Type 1s, in her book, she says, please hear this. You were never meant to be perfect. What you must begin to see is that things can be flawed and good. Things can be not as planned, they can go not as planned, and exactly as they should. You can have imperfections and be perfectly acceptable just as you are. Your vice of reform and perfectionism is also your virtue. You can learn to perfect yourself. You can learn to reform yourself and the world. And part of that perfection, the real perfection, the higher version of perfectionism or being good enough, is that we have this and, that there's room for both. Release the idea that you are in any way responsible for the behavior of other people. Take rest in knowing that you cannot make choices for others. You can only choose how you respond to them. Practice humble curiosity. When you run into disagreements, there are many points of view, and you do not always have to have the best one. It's not about the best one. You are not always right. This should feel like a relief, because it is what makes you human, and it gives you permission to make mistakes. Cultivate kindness and understanding for yourself as you are right now. Be perfect at having understanding about yourself right now. When we feel safe and loved, we feel more freedom to grow, because we're starting from a place of security and strength. So if you want to really perfect yourself, give yourself some slack, then you can really move into that place. So start cultivating self-acceptance. Don't save it as a reward when you finish and when you felt like you've earned it. Do it now. Let go of the idea that feelings are good or bad. To be human is to feel. Listen to your anger because it can teach you things and find healthy ways to express it, whether that's journaling or therapy. Anger rises in you for a reason, and if you don't release it, it will either find its way out in hurtful ways or fester into bitterness inside of you. Type 1s are triggered by imperfection or making a mistake or messing up. And when they do that, they have a tendency toward criticism, whether it's toward the self or toward others. But there are distinct strengths of a type 1. They have vision. They're very prudent. They understand justice. They have self-control. It's innate in them. They don't have to try. They are full of integrity. They are very organized. They're innovative, and they can focus. So you type 1s, help the rest of us learn those traits without judging us for not having those. Those are your strengths. And because they're not our strengths doesn't mean that we are flawed or imperfect. So back to the motivating fears of I will mess up, I'm not good enough, something's wrong with me. Then type 1s might have the tendency to have some of this negative thinking. They might look at something that like an essay and they might say, that's great, but there was a typo. And that typo will just stand out huge and it'll feel like there's just something wrong with that essay because there's a typo and it feel like it's all ruined, it's not good enough. So an empowered way of looking in that is the essay had a flaw in it, like everything does, but most of it was great. I will see it for what it is, flawed and good. Another thinking that might happen was, I should eat healthier, which type 1s will have a lot of should statements. But an empowered thought might be, I haven't made it a priority to eat healthy, but I can choose to now if I want to in this moment. Either way, it's my choice. Another thought, I should know better by now. I'm such a failure. And they label themselves. I think we talked about in the last episode all of these negative thinking traps, but labeling themselves as I should know better. I am such a failure. I am this. The alternative thought to that was failing does not make me a failure. It makes me a human. This mistake is here to teach me something. I will learn from it and grow. So the important, empowering question for the type 1 is, how will I choose to define good enough right now? And know that I can redefine it in another space again. So this is, how will I choose to define good enough right now? And letting go, reforming the idea that we're going to have this certainty. Here's the formula. Here's what it looks like. We figured it out. And then we're done. That's an important question to ask yourselves constantly. In the book, Enneagram Empowerment, there's this section on self-care for each of the types, which I think is fascinating. And I want to take some time to do that. They talk about self-care in heart, body, and mind is how they put it. So heart is emotional, body, physical, mind, mental. So self-care for a type 1 would look like in the heart. Some ideas are to watch a comedy show, read a funny book, or call a friend who makes you laugh. Play games that you enjoyed as a child. When you feel frustrated with yourself, speak to yourself as if you were speaking to a friend, if they were in your shoes. Say things out loud to yourself in the mirror or write them down on a piece of paper so that you have more poignancy. Body self-care. Start seeing food on a spectrum of less nutritious to more nutritious instead of a category of unhealthy or healthy. French fries don't have any vitamins or minerals to offer, so they are lower on the spectrum than some things. But everything in life is a balance. So just be sure you're getting foods that are high in on the spectrum too, like vegetables. So you have the fries, and then you're also going to have this. It really helps to kind of bring in more instead of divide and cut out, where other types, that's going to be the opposite. But for you, it's about bringing in. You're more of an editor. So the practice for you is to bring in and to add. The word "and" is a really good word for you to add to your vocabulary and use it often. Find a way to exercise that feels fun and maybe even a little goofy, like roller skating, hula hooping, playing frisbee, taking a dance class, rock climbing, or joining a soccer league. Also, physically, take 3 long, deep breaths through your nose. This is how you can support yourself, self-care body. To go into the mind and mindfully take care of ourselves. She says, when you want to say should or should have, say could or could have instead. Make a list of concerns that are your responsibility to take care of versus ones that are not your responsibility. Kind of get it out on paper. Also, every time you critique yourself, pay yourself one genuine compliment as well. So that's where the "and" can come in. Oh, I could have done that better. Oh, that was so dumb. Why did I do that? And I'm still a good person, and I have another opportunity tomorrow. So that "and" is a really important part of a type 1. And I understand that because I'm a type 2. And so there's a lot of type 1 because I sit next to it. There's a lot that I can identify with. That being said, the numbers don't mean anything. 1 is not better than 2. 2 is not better than 3. They're just a symbol of identification. There's really nothing about the number that's significant. We just start with number 1. Maybe it would be A, B, C. We just do numbers. 1 is not first. 1 is not second. That doesn't matter. That's insignificant. Moving into the wings of a type 1, you're going to be a type 1 with a 9 wing or a type 1 with a 2 wing. And my personal opinion is I think, really people will say, they will name themselves, I'm a 1-9 or I am a 1-2, and they will claim themselves and define themselves as their type and wing. And I just am convinced that sometimes we have both of those. Like I said in the last episode, it's like those are really the wings. And if we just have one wing, we kind of just move in circles. We need both the wings. And so if we see that we're mostly a 1 with a 9, then I would say use some of the type 2 to balance you out, to kind of help you even out and fly straight and fly high, because we need to make those balanced. And so I think that we kind of show up in different scenarios with the different wings, depending on what's happening. And then at best, hopefully, when we practice, we show up with our 1 in the dominant, and then we have our type 9 and our type 2 as that equal support. That's the goal. And even from there, shifting into kind of learning all of the types. In the last episode, we talked about how it represents the prism, or the face of God is another name for the symbol, that all of these qualities are important. And when we put them all together, that is true perfectionism. That's when we use each of these parts of us, because we have all of these parts within us in a balanced way, then we become unstoppable. So a type 1 leaning toward their 9 is going to be more of a reformer that's trying to get things done, but they do it in a very peaceful way. They do it in a very, they kind of blend with other people and kind of want them to follow them by making a friendship with them, because the 9 is a peacemaker. It's the one that can kind of blend in anywhere. So a 1 with more showing up with one of its 9 is going to look different than a 1 showing up with its 2, which is the helper. So you've got this reformer who's going to change the world, mixed with the helper. It's going to be a little more doing versus the peacemaker, which is a little more being. Does that make sense? But what a gift for that 1 to have this helper, which is the one that will help people get to where we need to go. versus just their own where they just want to tell them to go. So they're going to bring a little bit of that helper in, and then they're going to bring a little bit of that peacemaker in, and then that reformer comes from a place of balance that is really powerful, really, really powerful. And interesting thing about these Enneagram types is we have levels of development. So we might come in and be unhealthy. So you might see somebody and they're like, they're a type 1. They're not anything like that. Well, there's different levels of, people call them maybe levels of development. People call them healthy or unhealthy levels. There's redeemed. Sometimes in our lowest forms of ourselves, we're kind of this unhealthy level. Sometimes that will kind of be where we are more of the time. Our goal is to ascend and move into the healthy levels, or the places where we show up at our best. So just some examples of those are, unhealthy 1 would maybe be highly dogmatic. They would just say, this is right, this is wrong. They'd be very self-righteous, maybe intolerant or inflexible. They're very absolute. They are the only ones that know, they understand the truth and they know the truth, and that's it. And when somebody else doesn't agree with them, they are wrong. They may criticize other people harshly or judge them harshly, and they might rationalize their own harshness as being because it's right, it's justified. They can be cruel and they can be severe. Unhealthy type 1 maybe would have a breakdown or likely a suicide attempt because they're so stuck in that perfection or that need to be, for everything to be a certain way, that it stunts them and stops them. They might be obsessive compulsive because they can't handle things unless everything's just right. Okay, that's the type. Those are unhealthy levels of type 1. The average level, just we show up and do our thing. They might come across as very picky and then judgmental and opinionated, and they might kind of correct people or nag people. Maybe they will be very impatient. Maybe at a little more healthy stage, they might be afraid of making mistakes, so they might not be able to make any choices. Just coming in an average, or I call it, the lower end, I call it like an egoic form, and then I call it on autopilot. When we're just kind of on autopilot, we're not trying, then we might get stuck, or the type 1 would be stuck and kind of need to keep everything very rigid and be very compulsive about things. Maybe they would be a workaholic. They might become idealists, or this idea that it's not good enough until it reaches a certain point of view, which again, just to recognize type 1s, that other people don't struggle with that. The other types don't struggle with that the way you do. We don't think there needs to be a certain way. That's not how we kind of roll. But our goal is to get to an enlightened version of ourselves. And for the type 1 reformer, at their best, okay, so this is at their best, they become principled and fair. They are ethical. Their primary values are truth and justice. They have a sense of responsibility. So instead of just criticizing everybody for not doing it right, they have maybe an enlightened or a healthy level of type 1 will actually go in and have responsibility to say, hey, we need to work on this. I'm here to do what I got to do to make it better. They'll have a sense of right and wrong, but they are willing to do the work to get everybody there. Enlightened type 1 will have very strong values, and they will be very moral. They will be reasonable, but they will be moderate in things. They will learn moderation. And at their best, they will become extraordinarily wise and discerning. They accept what is, and they can know the best action in each moment because they edit out the things that are imperfect, but we're doing it in this enlightened way. They can be very humane, inspiring, and hopeful. Type 1s are a gift to the rest of us. They bring an understanding of where the human race can go, where potential lies, and you help us be better and create better ways of living and being, and you're willing to stand up for those and put your work where it needs to be to get us there in this enlightened state. So the last thing that I want to talk about with the Enneagram is just how the Enneagram will interact with the other types. When the type 1 is interacting with the type 2, they might see, now this might be more negative and positive, I'll try and think about both, but a reformer will look at a type 2 as just helping out. What's the point? What are you doing? Why are you helping? What are you going to get out of that? They're very much about, is your helping worthwhile? Is it for right purposes? A type 1 and working with a type 3 are very similar in that they have a discipline to them. So a type 1 and a type 3 have that in common, that discipline, that wanting to achieve things. A type 1 has that as well. A type 1 with a type 4, again, it moves into type 4 under stress. So a type 1 with a type 4, those two dynamics together, the 1 is probably going to look like they're more outgoing, more out in the world compared to the type 4. The 4 is going to look a little more quiet to themselves, and that's okay. A type 1 with a type 5, those two are going to be very much about debating logic. They're going to be very much about understanding each other and wanting to get into the nitpickies of things. A type 1 and a type 6. The type 1 is a reformer, and they're very loyal to their right and wrong. And a type 6 is kind of loyal first, and then they don't want to really change anyone else, where the reformer will want to change them. The 6 just kind of wants to go and be like the other person. So a 6 can follow right along underneath. Probably a type 1 might be more of a follower than a leader in that role. A type 1 is very much of a leader. The type 1 and the type 7 is going to be an interesting dynamic. The enthusiast, which is really where the type 1 goes for help, but they're going to see the type 7 as undisciplined and too optimistic and easygoing and that type of thing, and yet that's the very thing that they need to kind of lean into when they're in stress, kind of borrow some of those things for a little bit. And when I say move into these areas, for me, again, I'm a type 2, and I look for help in the type 4. So in that type 4, so where I'm always helping, I need to move into a place of maybe a little of isolation. And type 4s are very artistic. So when I'm feeling down and low, it's really valuable for me to create something. So whether that's a craft, or I bake something or make something or garden something, but I move into this creative place of building something creatively, which is very different from helping someone else. And it's very different than me, but it helps pull me out of my upset or anger that I might have going into my type 8. So a type 1 looking to those positivity and optimistic of a 7 enthusiast helps to pull them out of this isolation and emotional feelings that isn't themselves. We talked about that earlier. A type 1 and a type 8, the challenger, those are they're kind of going to be, I would say, the 1, the 3, and the 8. There's going to kind of be a challenge of who's in charge and who's the leader and who's the follower. And especially if there's the egoic versions of ourselves, that's going to be a little bit of friction there. And the 1, and then we talked about the 1 and the 9. those people, the reformer is going to kind of maybe look at the peacemaker and just kind of think that they're a little weak or that they take it easy, but they'll also both of them will identify with each other because they are next to each other on the Enneagram. So they kind of share some qualities, even though they're very different. The 1 and the 9 are very different, but they support each other beautifully. To wrap up, there's just to remember that the type 1 is part of the body triad, and the body triad we need to understand this. You will feel an impact physically in your body interacting with the world. So, and you might have more physical manifestations of your emotions or your thoughts. Or when someone's talking to you, you pay attention to those physical sensations in your body. They're teaching you something. You're also dealing with anger. There might be some deep-seated anger inside that wants to come out. And a reformer kind of keeps wanting to tamp that down in order to do the right thing or to be nice or to do it the way we're supposed to. And so a type 1 reformer, we've got to reform that idea and recognize that when we feel anger, what is it asking us to reform? If we're on the road and we get road rage, a type 1 would get a road rage, and there's that anger there. And instead of just shutting it down, not all the anger triad would do this, but the ones do. Instead of shutting that down, they're going to use that as a key. What's happening here? And chances are you're going to say, oh, well, there was an injustice. This guy just cut me off, and that's an injustice. That's what my anger was for. Instead of tamping it down, it's really important for type 1s to get curious about their body and the sensations that are going in and the anger and what that's trying to teach them. And finally, like we talked about in the last episode, the type 1s move toward others in being compliant. Where maybe the type 8 moves against other people. When I say that type 1 and type 8s are similar, the type 1 is going to move into, they're going to say, oh, let's go in and figure out what the problem is. Let's move into the situation and make it better. Someone's not doing okay. Let's go ask them what they need. It's more this energy of moving into, and is very different than maybe the other types. So that is type 1, the reformer. What would we do without you? How would we get through being the best that we could be without all the gifts that you have? Move away from negative thinking about needing to be right, needing to be good. Practice accepting that there's an and, that we make mistakes and we're good enough. Next time we will move into type 2 and kind of go over the same scenarios with the type 2. Again, you can download the graphic of the Enneagram. There's a link in the show notes. There's also to take the free Enneagram test and to buy the book that I'm using so much for these episodes. So we'll see you next time. Type 1 reformers, you're awesome. We invite you to the wholenessnetwork.com, where you'll find the Wholeness Library. Inside, you'll find tutorials, downloads, mini classes, and all sorts of streaming content for you on your wholeness journey.